Greetings, everyone. I'm Michael O'Hanlon with the Brookings Institution, and privileged today to be talking about cyber threats facing our country and the world with three extraordinary and extraordinarily gifted and accomplished individuals. We have with us Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Leslie Ireland, the former Assistant Secretary, also an experienced CIA analyst who has worked on cyber and related matters and sanctions matters for her long, illustrious career, is still affiliated with a number of organizations now, including the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., and really one of the nation's top experts on cybercrime and on financial issues related to that specifically. Chairman Mike Rogers was congressman for Michigan for many years. He's got an amazing career that began also as an Army officer and with the FBI. He served in the Michigan State Senate. He, of course, was the chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. It's hard to imagine much better preparation for the topic we have today, but he's continued to expand and diversify and broaden his depth and his knowledge in areas of cyber and other related matters in his time since stepping down from Congress. I'm very grateful to have his participation as well. And then finally, the very accomplished author, Fred Kaplan, who's written a book on cyber called Dark Territory, which is a fantastic read that I recommend, but also is known for his Wizards of Armageddon and a number of other books. He knows how to dive into technical issues, but make them approachable and make them digestible for the broader public debate, always with an eye towards informing public policy and key public awareness of major issues of the day. So that's our basic lay of the land. And what we've agreed to do is to begin with Secretary Ireland, then go to Chairman Rogers, and then to Fred, and talk a little bit about, in the first round of our discussion, what is the basic and fundamental and maybe most pressing or most underappreciated cyber danger facing the country today. So I'm going to ask each one to sort of riff off of that question, maybe have a little bit of follow-up, establish those thoughts and positions on the table as a foundation for then having some more conversation amongst ourselves, and then fielding any questions that may come in from you if you're watching via the chat. And we realize there is a taping phenomenon here, so some people will be watching as we are taping on the Ides of March. Others will be watching closer to the Ides of April, and so the questions will come from those who are with us today here on March 15th. Without further ado, Secretary Ireland, thank you very much for joining us. It's a real privilege, and I want to again tip my cap for your career, really delving into these issues at the working level with such diligence for so long. And I'm sure that really equips you to answer this question of what you see as the top cyber danger or challenge facing the country today. Over to you, my friend.
Well, thank you, Mike. And I just want to say I'm honored to be on this panel. Congressman Rogers and I crossed paths many years ago, and I always appreciated his leadership on the HPSI and valued it as oversight was such a critical process of what we did in intelligence. And Fred and I are going to be new friends. I don't know if he knows that yet, but we're going to be new friends, and I look forward to reading his book. You know, as I pondered this question, I decided to take it in a slightly different direction than maybe you're anticipating. And I'm not going to identify a specific threat actor. I think the biggest challenge that we are facing today is that as a country, we're still very early in the process of identifying a comprehensive systemic response to cybersecurity threats, particularly in areas of critical infrastructure. The interconnectivity of the grid means that an attack will never be isolated. So whether it's spear phishing or whether it's ransomware or whether, as we've seen recently, it's third-party software vulnerabilities, it doesn't stay put, it spreads. And coming at it from a perspective at Treasury and the financial sector, there's a clear vulnerability there. Let me give you a couple of examples. They're not cyber, but I think they're illustrative. So in the wake of Superstorm Sandy in 2012, the financial sector largely was able to regain its operational capacity, but was slowed down because of issues in the energy and telecommunications sectors, supporting industries, but nevertheless very critical. Another example is on 9/11, and again, not a cyber example, but on 9/11, the roads, tunnels, and bridges in and out of lower Manhattan were closed down because you needed to get first responders in and out quickly. I understand that. Banks started to understand that they were going to need to keep cash, both in branches and in ATMs. The challenge in Lower Manhattan is the New York Fed kept its cash in New Jersey, and they couldn't get it into the city. And imagine the kind of chaos you could have if you're in the wake of a terrorist attack and people go to an ATM and it's dry and you can't get your money out. So there are all kinds of things that you need to think about, and the time to think about them now, particularly in the face of a cyber attack, is now, so you can be planning for those unintended consequences and for resiliency. Real quickly, there is an effort underway. It was started by the financial sector, started by the 8 globally systemically important banks, called the Financial Sector Analysis and Resiliency Center, designed to identify where those critical nodes are and how to build resiliency into it. In the last year, it's gone to become the Analysis and Resiliency Center for systemic risk, and it has broadened to include the energy sector. So there are the very nascent beginnings of that, but I think as a country, as we look at protecting our national economy, we have to think about an integrated response to cyber threats.
That's a fantastic framing. And if I could ask one follow-up question before we go to Chairman Rogers for his thoughts. When you mentioned 9/11, it brings me back to thinking about some of the writing that Richard Clarke has done on this subject and some of the work he did in government. And of course, he had a key role right at the time of 9/11. And in the aftermath, there was an effort to try to identify, as I recall, something like 18 key areas of infrastructure that might require protection. This was not necessarily cyber protection per se, but it was resilience against various kinds of terrorist threat, physical or electronic or otherwise. And of course, it was hard to get the country to focus on 18 sectors at the same time. So about 10 years later, Clarke wrote a very well-received book on cyber war, in which, at the risk of oversimplification, and with apologies to him if he's watching, I think he decided to narrow down from 18 to 1. And he went to the electricity grid. And he said, that's at the heart of everything. So let's start by protecting that from physical and cyber attack. Do you think that was the correct way to begin to simplify the problem so that we can perhaps make headway? Or is it better to stick with all 18 and recognize we're going to have to make this multidimensional from the start, even at the risk of overloading the system, so to speak? Or is that not a useful way to frame the discussion?
So I'm going to be an analyst about this. I'm going to say it depends. There is always a long pole in the tent. And I think I would tend to agree that energy will be your long pole in the tent because everything else will hinge on that. However, if you say it's the energy sector, you may take the foot off the gas of the other parts of the sector. And in fact, each and every sector needs to be looking internally at itself and understanding what its own vulnerabilities are and then preparing for them accordingly. What I'm talking about is an interconnectivity, even I would argue tabletop exercises that include different sectors so that they all understand the implications of actions that they take and then can discuss and prepare from there.
Excellent. Thank you. We'll come back to this, I'm sure, in the discussion. But Chairman Rogers, if I could now ask you, please, sir, to respond to the same general question. What's most on your mind? What most keeps you awake at night? Or what do you think we need to appreciate, as a risk more than we have so far? Over to you. I think you're still muted.
Oops. I do my best work on mute, by the way. I make the most sense when I'm on mute. First of all, I'm also honored to be on this panel. Fantastic. I have admired Secretary Ireland's work in her career. She has been a great leader on all of these topics and tried to move that ship even a degree or two. And I think she's done at least that. So thank you for that work. And Fred, I also look forward to reading that book. I can't wait to get at it. I thought I'd take a little bit of a different approach. So if I look at, the way we look at cyber today, we want to have a level of deterrence. We have to defend what we have. We need resilience and then mitigation, kind of in that order in my mind. And candidly, we're not ready on any of them. And I think the SolarWinds to me was the prime example. Back in 2008, the world changed on cyber forever. Most of America yawned and moved on, but the Russians used a prepping the battlefield with cyber warfare in South Ossetia in Georgia. Before the shooting started, they laid down a very aggressive 2-week cyber campaign. We saw what they did to Estonia, very sophisticated, destructive cyber campaign in Estonia to further their political aims. And what we saw, by the way, and our reaction was, boy, that looks bad. We probably should do something about that. And since then, the government is almost in the same place that we were before when it looks at a collective defense of what we have in .gov, let alone across the country in critical infrastructure. So I'm very worried that we're just not dealing with the problem. And to me, SolarWinds was the great example of this. Really sophisticated effort, very high-end nation state. Obviously, the press has said that it's the Russians. I happen to personally believe it was the Russians. If you look at the kinds of successes they had in the penetration, this is what worries me most. So very, very successful. They operated like a penetration intelligence campaign from stem to stern. So they did all the research, they did social engineering, they used every aspect of cyber penetration and intelligence to breach these networks. The one couple of things that set it apart in my mind, it wasn't the fact that they used supply chain. This has been an old problem. We've known about supply chain vulnerabilities for a long time in cyber. Matter of fact, criminal elements have been using supply chain to engage in criminal activity for years. So the nation state piece of that didn't surprise me, but what did was their ability to mimic protocols. And so they were, once they penetrated SolarWinds, they were able to mimic security protocols so that when it was handed off to the government systems looked at that and said, oh yeah, this is clear, it's good. And then what would happen inside the system, the next group that got it would put their security protocol on it. So by the time it got to its end point, it had traversed all of these security protocols. You couldn't even tell that it came from SolarWinds #1. That is a really hard thing to do. It's very sophisticated. And I thought, oh boy, that's a problem for us. The second part of that is that they got into the 8 organizations that were supposed to be watching and helping mitigate this problem. They were monitoring all the traffic of those organizations. So anytime somebody said, hey, gee, boy, something doesn't look right, guess what? The Russians knew that they were saying something doesn't look right. They were able to adjust in real time to make this thing go longer than it might not have already done. They also used a pretty sophisticated technique of stealing tools from a company that does network mapping. They stole those tools and repurposed it and used those tools to map the networks once they were through the firewalls into the U.S. government. Again, really hard to do, really sophisticated, had to be really patient. And then the level of penetration was unbelievable. They were targeting, they were looking for whales, clearly. They weren't just trying to proliferate. They were looking for whale targets, the things where they could get the most information, the most bang for their buck. But they also went after privileged access individuals, targeted those individuals, and then mimicked some of their behavior, and then used their penetration of these senior individuals with privileged access to create their own accounts in the system so that they would have this kind of super administrative access. They were creating their own accounts. They didn't have to steal through other accounts anymore. They were using their own created accounts within the system because they had been so sophisticated in getting access in that way. That was a game changer for me. When I saw the level of patience, planning, and intelligence operation, I thought, wow, this should send another message to us, how unprepared we are. The reason all of that's concerning is if it had been a different organization within Russian intelligence, they would have turned things off. They would have broke things. This was an intelligence gathering operation by an organization in the Russian intelligence service that's designed to collect information. If it had been another one that we know, let me use South Ossetia as an example, who used that organization to destroy things, to turn things off, to create chaos, we would be in a ton of trouble today. Well, the very fact that they still have that capability, they used it very recently with that really high level penetration, just tells me how far away we are from deterrence, from defense, and from resilience. By the way they create these they call them droppers. I don't want to go into too much detail here, bore your audience to death, but they call them droppers. But what they do is create administrative files that look pretty normal. Even if you scan them, doesn't look abnormal. It's things that would do administrative functions throughout the day. We know that they penetrated a U.S. government agency in the past, and they are still, think of this, still trying to get it all out. Well, when you look at the sheer penetration of these 18,000 companies and across the U.S. government, we will be finding this stuff in code, I'm going to guess, for years, trying to figure out and to get them out. That all worries me, again. So if you look at it, and I said this in an op-ed recently, and it got a lot of attention, some good, some not so good. If we were in a shooting cyber war, right, the way the Russians used it in Georgia, South Ossetia, the way the Iranians used it against Saudi Aramco, the way that the Russians used it in Estonia, in that kind of a shooting, I'm turning, breaking things off, we would lose. We don't have the resiliency built into this system that we would able to become back up and get back online. That's why I worry about it. That's why this, to me, this sense of urgency is so important, that we get to a collective defense in government, where we're all doing this together. We're still so bifurcated. It's you know, in 2021, we still have different budgets, different CIOs trying to go their own direction inside government agencies. And this is the result of that. It makes it much easier for sophisticated adversaries to get in. So to me, that's the biggest problem we have. And second to that, they were smart. They used U.S. laws against us. The very fact that they used U.S. domain names and U.S. servers to launch these attacks meant that our best player on the field to stop something like this was legally prohibited from engaging, which is the NSA, because it was a U.S.-based server. And so we've got a lot of work to do. Our adversaries know it. We've watched the Chinese mimic what the Russians were doing in Microsoft's penetration, some 30,000 different networks they think that they got into. So it's coming in waves. And we're still trying to figure out how we get to collective defense. That's what I worry about. I just don't know if our sense of urgency is there. And I don't believe we have the right deterrence in place. I think Secretary Ireland made that point. And we certainly aren't doing the right things on defense. And so on that uplifting note, I give it back. Again, my whole thing is we're just going to have to step up our game here. And we should have a sense of urgency. I just don't think we have.
Very compelling. Let me ask one follow-up to you as well, if I could. When you say we would lose, I'd like to ask you to explain a little more of what you mean. Do you mean that Russia could so slow us down that we couldn't, let's say, for example, respond to a physical attack on a NATO ally because our infrastructure wouldn't be able to support the movement of trains, ships, planes, et cetera, as well as whatever dependence we have on the national domestic infrastructure grid for DOD? Or do you mean more narrowly that if we have a limited kind of back and forth where we're attacking their cyber systems and they're attacking ours, that they could do more harm to us because of our greater, vulnerability within that specific domain?
Well, they clearly can do more harm to us because we are so connected. And again, the government owns, 10% of the networks out there. Most of the private sector networks own the rest, about 90%. They have the ability to break things and turn them off. It would make even normal logistics operations as simple as getting things from depots to the port. It would be very disruptive to us. And then we have all the civilian chaos that would go with it. So look at Texas. What happened in Texas for those days, it was weather related, but how that just shut the state of Texas down without energy, without cash, without gasoline, without groceries. Guess what? And this is a big shooting war. I'm not talking about these one-offs, proven points. I'm talking about someone decides they really want to cause problems for the United States. And part of that problem is resiliency. They said if we were going to go in and just the best way to get them out would have been replace every server that got touched by that patch from SolarWinds. There were not enough servers available in the world to do that. So you think about, we just turn it off and reboot it. It doesn't work that way. And we were just not prepared if that were to have happened. We're not prepared for that today. And our adversaries know it. And this is a weakness that we're going to have to get around here, I think, pretty quickly.
Fantastic.
So,
well,
Mike,
thank you.
If I could
go ahead, please.
Just add something to Chairman Rogers' comment. I love the way you laid this out and what differentiated this attack. One other thing that I heard was that, at least in the case of FireEye, they built a completely separate architecture for the attack on FireEye. So the attack on FireEye had its own ISP address. Something that we've depended upon traditionally in the face of an attack is sharing an IP address. This defeats that. And I heard the head of FireEye, Kevin Mandiant, say the way they found it was because they noticed that a FireEye employee had a second device come up. So they were operating as though they were an approved FireEye employee. They went to that employee and said, did you put a second device on the system? And they said no, and that's what started the unraveling. So I couldn't agree with Chairman Rogers more. The level of sophistication is stunning, and it can't be underestimated.
Thank you both. And now, Fred, the same question to you as we're getting plenty on the table here for discussion. I look forward very much to your overarching take on the problem and the greatest challenge facing us in the cyber realm today. Over to you, my friend.
Okay, well, thank you. I would take a somewhat broader perspective. I would refer to this not as a cyber threat, but as the cyber situation. The threat, I'm not a Luddite. Computer networks are wonderful, but the threat was embedded in the technology as it was set up from the beginning. In the mid-'60s, when ARPANET was about to roll out, there was a computer scientist named Willis Ware. He was the head of the computer science division of the RAND Corporation. He'd worked with von Neumann on the first electronic computers. He was also, though this wasn't stated at the time, he was the science advisor to the NSA. Because the NSA, as we know, no such agency. It didn't exist. But he was the science advisor to the NSA. He put out a paper, and he said, look, this is a great thing that you guys are doing. I understand the whole point of it, but there's a problem here. Anytime you have remote access to communication systems, you're going to create inherent vulnerabilities. There might be a time when you won't be able to keep secrets anymore. And so the head of the ARPANET project took Willis Ware's paper to his team and said, what do you think of this? And they said, oh, God, look, please don't saddle us with a security requirement, too. Look how long it took us to do what we've done. It'll be decades before the Russians can do anything like this. And it's true. It was 2-3 decades before the Russians can do anything. But in the meantime, whole systems and whole networks had grown up with no provisions for security. I mean, to really change this situation fundamentally, you would have to go back and start all over again. And this paper was classified secret. It's unclassified now. You can go look at it. It's a fascinating paper. But it wasn't really until the 1980s when, after Ronald Reagan watched the movie War Games, he asked his advisors, could something like this really happen? The kid unwittingly breaks into the NORAD computer and simulates World War III. And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said, let me look into that, sir. And he comes back and says, the situation is much worse than you think. And this led to the first presidential directive on what is now called cybersecurity in 1984. And you can go back, and it was called NSDD 145, which is also now declassified. It reads exactly the same as every national security directive on the subject today. But it did one thing. It was basically written by the NSA. And so they gave themselves all of the power to set standards for every computer in the United States, personal, corporate, governmental. As a result of which, Congress said, no, we're not going to allow this. The NSA cannot put its hands in domestic surveillance. So they split it up. They put the NSA in charge of .mil, and they put a division of the Commerce Department, which has now been inherited by the Homeland Security Department, in charge of civilian stuff. Well, the problem was the Commerce Department had no resources, no expertise, no technology for any of this stuff. If you look at .mil, I mean, basically over time, there are really only about 8 or 9 points of intersection between the military internet and the outside internet. So if there's an attack on the military, you have a pretty good chance of getting it. Thousands of points have proliferated in every place else. And even now, the Department of Homeland Security is trying to to wrap its hands around this, and they just cannot. So I guess the hopeful lesson to many of those watching it is that if you have a career in cybersecurity, your future is set. You know, we could cure cancer, we could have colonies on Mars. Cybersecurity, unless there's some complete overhaul of everything, is still going to be a serious problem, and it's because we can mitigate the threat. We can engage in really what will be a never-ending offense-defense arm race. I mean, the next step is going to be to artificial intelligence networks, you know, ramping up at the speed of light to overwhelm what the other artificial intelligence network has just done. But it's going to be ramping up all the time. This is just the nature of things. One thing we can do is try to get some things off of the internet. I mean, I know that the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy have units that are like the Air Force has some unit that the squadron doesn't have any. They're not plugged in at all. I know that in the Navy, they've started to train Navy officers on ships to communicate, to navigate with a sextant, you know, by the stars at night, like back in the 19th century, so that when, not if, but when GPS is cut off, they can at least know where they are in the middle of the ocean. One thing, and let's not cut corners here. I mean, the kinds of things that countries are doing to us, we're doing to them too. I mean, this is what the NSA has been about. But that's not necessarily a form of assurance. What this means is that if a war seems to be about to step up, both sides are going to have an incentive to pull a cyber attack first before the other side pulls a cyber attack. So that there's kind of a, yes, they used to call it computer network exploitation and computer network attack. Exploitation was intelligence, attack was attack. The only difference between the two is one extra step. You push the button. Everybody has computer network exploitation into each other's critical infrastructure and military and everything. The real danger is that there will be an incentive for preemption if it looks like a war is going to start up. So it's not like, should we go cyber? No, probably one side or the other or both will go cyber right away to weaken the other side's forces before the other side goes cyber to weaken that other side's capabilities. So it's a real quandary with there's no magic coin here. There's nothing that's just going to say, oh, okay, this is all over. It's kind of a permanent situation.
Thank you, Fred. And I think I'll now ask about what we can do about it, which is the logical next step in the conversation. And some of you have already touched on that. And maybe we can go in reverse order. So I'll come back to you, Fred, with this in a second. But it strikes me in listening to all of you and in my own readings that there are maybe at least three different ways I would think about possible solutions. One is primarily about process and organization. For example, asking if it's really correct that DHS be in charge of security for the rest of government, and then basically no overarching public organization have any responsibility for private sector infrastructure, except through some very limited regulation. Is that an adequate way to think about setting up our oversight and protection where, again, the Department of Defense protects its own systems, DHS protects other federal systems, and nobody protects the private sector? Again, some risk of oversimplification, but is that acceptable? That would be one set of questions I would have. The second would be about some of the measures, the specific technical measures that you've alluded to, such as taking certain things off the internet, the so-called famous air gap debate. Is that a realistic way to protect our most crucial infrastructure, or does too much of our infrastructure depend on being, inherently on being plugged in? So electricity grids need to know what their customers are doing and using. It's the idea of taking them off the grid, quote unquote, becomes pretty hard. And then third, since we're in an era, for better or worse, of the federal government pumping out huge stimulus bills in the multi-trillion-dollar range, And even those of us who, normally worry about fiscal balance or fiscal responsibility have been told not to worry too much for the next few months or year because, we have more urgent priorities with COVID. Obviously, that's becoming a bigger debate and maybe a partisan debate again already. But nonetheless, we are inclined right now towards largesse on the federal side. And should we take advantage of that moment? Are there certain kinds of resources that need to be pumped into this problem to require more servers, or more capacity for replacing software, or new kinds of software where Microsoft may not have an incentive to patch up all of its flaws before shipping out to customers because they can always patch up the next iteration. But for key infrastructure, we sort of need a higher standard. Is this the right moment to, pump money into producing dedicated software that's less vulnerable, even if it is more costly? So again, there's process and structure. There's specific technical matters like taking things off the grid. And then there's the resources that might be needed to improve our game. But those are just three broad areas I can think of as ways to try to mitigate some of these vulnerabilities. But you three probably have better ways to frame and create a taxonomy. So let me ask you, what's the right path, the right general philosophy, and the right, specific set of policies going forward? You don't have to each do a comprehensive fix to our cyber vulnerabilities, but I would be interested in what strikes you as the most pressing, and doable, actionable kind of policy initiative, starting with Fred.
Well, there have been attempts over the period. You mentioned Richard Clarke. When he was the cybersecurity guy in the White House under Clinton, he wrote a draft memo suggesting that all critical infrastructure be placed on a parallel internet, which could be monitored by a government agency. It wasn't said which one, but it was pretty obvious, that could monitor if there was an attack. Okay, this was leaked. It was denounced by people in Congress as Orwellian, and it was taken out of the memo. More recently, in 2010, the last year of the Bush administration, Robert Gates, Secretary of Defense, realized that, NSA was really the place where this was happening. It had no authority, and by the way, rightly so, in domestic surveillance. DHS was hopeless. They just couldn't do this. And so he got together with Janet Napolitano, who was the Secretary of Homeland Security at the time, and they wrote a memorandum of understanding, which was that Napolitano would appoint a new deputy of the NSA. I mean, it would be done formally by Gates, but she would pick it. And this person would be able to access, in case of an attack on critical infrastructure, would be able to access the technology of the NSA with the legal authority of DHS. And they also started, they were supposed to exchange, like each agency was supposed to send 10 people over like a cultural exchange program. Well, this collapsed, mainly because there were people in the White House and also one of Napolitano's own deputies who didn't like the idea, this is back in 2010, who just abhorred the notion of the internet becoming a war zone and of the internet being talked about as a domain, like the Air Force talks about the air domain and the Navy talks about the sea domain. And so it also fell apart. I think of ideas like this, where it might be too late to have a parallel internet, but the idea of some kind of institutional sharing of agencies regarding the resources of one and the legal authority of the other, again, it's a little tricky and a little maybe clever. I think there might be more of an appetite for that because, I mean, like it or not, it is a war zone now. It is a domain now. The question is what to do about it.
Chairman Rogers, same question to you, please, my friend.
Yeah, thank you. On the process side, and I was there in 2010, there was something that happened prior to that, in the fact that Congress said it couldn't be the NSA, which is why they had to kind of try to cobble together the way they were trying to cobble it together. It really wasn't by their design. The Congress said, nope, that NSA can't do that. And remember that all of the Snowden years and all of the problems that came with the suspicion cast on our national security agency, by the way, has set us back a decade in trying to get our arms around this problem. Candidly, and I'll I say this, I know I have friends in DHS won't appreciate it. DHS is not capable of this. They haven't been able to accumulate the right talent in numbers to meet their mission demand. And we know where that talent is. We've artificially created, we took our best player and we didn't even let him out of the locker room. We said, you've got to stay in the locker room. We'll let these other players try to figure this out. And it just hasn't worked very well. Remember, in the SolarWinds, the agency that was designed, and it was a Department of Homeland Security agency to be the kind of the precursor of stopping these things, was being monitored by the hackers in real time, right? I mean, it just shows you this fundamental weakness in not trying to get this part right. And I get believe me, I've lived through all of that. I had to go to Europe after the Snowden revelations, which, by the way, were mostly wrong. The narrative was mostly wrong, but try to put that thing back in the box. Good luck. We were so far behind the narrative, we couldn't have an honest conversation about what really was happening versus what was alleged to be happening. And so all of that is a long way of saying that mucked it up getting the process right. I mean, and so I argue, listen, if you want to stop a foreign adversary who has nation state capability, are you really going to tell your private sector companies, even if they're really good, hey, guess what? If a missile comes in, we got it. If it's a all-out cyber attack, good luck with China. Good luck with Russia. Good luck with Iran. I hope that works out for you. I mean, if you think about it, we don't do anything like that in the national security space. I don't know why we do it here either. And so I think we are, as America, we're going to have to figure out what we want to do. What role do you want your national security agency to play in defending these companies that could take out our prosperity going forward? I mean, the impacts of this is very real. And so I think there's some things we can do. One, we tried a cyber sharing bill. My good partner, Dutch Ruppersberger, the congressman from Maryland, and I were on the committee. We realized, hey, we got to take a whack at this. So we came up with a sharing scheme so that we could share threat information in real time, machine to machine. We just passed a new version, I think, last year, or a version that still doesn't meet demands because of all this political baggage that was brought along. We don't really allow real-time machine-to-machine sharing of threat information between the government and the private sector, and the private sector back to the government. Why? Because people are a little nervous about it. I hope this SolarWinds thing wakes people up to the level of threat. Again, the only thing that saved us on that, it was an intelligence gathering operation. They decided not to be a destructive operation. Had it done a destructive operation, we'd have been in a world of hurt here in the country. So by process, I would argue this new start of a cyber director. By the way, I came full circle on this. I didn't support it when I was chairman. I actually testified for this bill recently to get a cyber director, somebody that can coordinate all cyber activities across the government, have a collective defense, meaning real-time sharing amongst all of the agencies of the federal government. And I would start to move that way in the private sector as well. To me, that's really important. We've got to have that collective defense in cyberspace with our private sector folks. Resources, listen, if we do this right, it shouldn't be as expensive as I've seen projected. But you have to have a private sector public commitment together to do it right. We have lots of resources at the NSA that could be very, very helpful in this, but we just won't let them play. And so we've got to, if we can get that hurdle down, do it in a way that protects privacy, protects civil rights, I'm all for that. And I think we can do it. Then I think you can start to get ahead. And by the way, that's just the defense side. We don't have a good deterrence. And I think Secretary Ireland was alluding to that, at least in her opening comments. We don't have good deterrence yet today on making sure people understand there's a cost involved and a consequence involved for doing things, using cyber to do bad things in the United States. Candidly, don't have it. I don't care if anyone tells you we do. I'm here to tell you we don't. It's not coordinated enough. It's not it clearly hasn't worked. If there is one, I certainly never saw it. And I haven't seen it yet today because the activities are ramping up. They're not going the other way. So I think there's a way to do this, but we're going to have to collectively, policymaker and American citizens decide, okay, do we want to protect ourselves from this, or do we want to hope for the best? I just never think hoping for the best is a good strategy to defend yourself.
Can I just add one thing to that?
Yeah.
A second. If you're going to do this, then you have to have two things going on at the same time, which have both been resisted. One, you have to have mandatory cybersecurity regulations for private critical infrastructure companies. They have always resisted this. You know, the R word is the worst word in their vocabulary. The second thing, I mean, we have Obama appointed, a federal CISA, but he didn't really have any authority. If you're going to have someone like this, the person has to have the authority, like to go into, some agency of the Bureau of Mines, notice they're still using Windows 95, and unplug them. Say, you are off the net until you get this updated. So there has to be real enforcement to this. That especially the regulation. I mean, that I cannot overstate. And corporations, and even when it came up in the Clinton administration, even Clinton's economic advisors, they said, "Oh no, regulation that will impede innovation and so forth," and maybe it will. But if you really want to be serious about this, that has to be part of the formula.
Aaron Rodgers, one last thing before we go to Secretary Ireland on the same question. Just to clarify, you've mentioned SolarWinds several times, and for good reason. And I don't know if you want to speak to the question about what, if anything, should be done in reply. You mentioned that the Russian agencies that were involved were apparently those just interested so far in intelligence, although I imagine they have the ability to share with Russian agencies that may have other intent. Do you think that we need to punish Russia? Or is this sort of the way that, as Fred noted earlier, that cyber intelligence happens in today's world? And it's not so much a question of trying to deter Russia from doing this in the future. It's making ourselves harder so that they can't, even if they try.
Yeah, well, I mean, I happen to believe that defense is a very important part of this. And this notion that you can't have defense, so therefore don't try, is wrong. I passionately disagree with that. You have to at least slow them down. And it doesn't mean they're going to stop them completely, no. Remember, this was an intelligence gathering operation. They had very specific targets. And what they laid out for us in the forensics is how sophisticated and patient they were to get to that end. And as you said, remember, this is just about walking across the street to a different directorate in Moscow and saying, guess where we are? Wouldn't you like to have this? And that's basically the reservation on doing that on behalf of the Russian government, Putin specifically, is what stopped a destructive attack that, again, would have been very, very catastrophic. And so I just don't think we should, wait around for the good intentions of our adversaries on this. And the reason I mention that is we need to start separating. I heard this from policymakers, and I thought it was wrong, where they said, the Russians attacked us, the Russians attacked us. That is not an attack. It is a highly sophisticated espionage operation that unfortunately was way too successful. That's what that was. And so we need to treat it like that. An attack is something different, where they're causing distress, disruption. They're breaking things so they don't work anymore, causing human consequences as well. Again, that's very different. And we need to get our terminology right, because the world of espionage and the world of war are well defined in history. So we need to kind of make sure we understand that in cyberspace as well, so we don't get ourselves in trouble on that. But again, the Russians should pay for this. There are ways that we can make them pay, and so that the shoe pinches a little bit. We're not very good at that yet. And part of it is, by the way, if we do something that hurts them, guess what? They don't have to come back to the U.S. government. They can go to the 90% of the networks that are privately held and cause more problems. And so this has been that disadvantage in an aggressive offensive cyber posture for the United States for decades, because our private sector is so exposed. And again, getting back to your process, maybe this is the time to figure out, how do we pull that sheet of defense over private companies when it comes to cyber attacks? I would love to have that debate. We had lots of debates in classified spaces about this, and it was always, boy, this is a hard problem. Let's talk about it again next week.
Right. Absolutely. Well, Leslie Ireland, over to you. And then I think we'll probably have one more round of just seeing how far we can get towards suggesting some specific potential fixes. But if you could just take your overall view on the problem and what we need to do differently. Thank you.
Sure. So, I mean, I appreciate the comments of Chairman Rogers and Fred already. And I was really struck in reading the findings of the Solarium Commission that noted that the parts of our country that are most vulnerable, that are most important to our economy, and in fact our national security, are not in the hands of the government. And to Chairman Rogers' point, you fire a missile at a bank and the U.S. military responds. You fire a DDoS attack at a bank and the bank needs to absorb it and to deal with it. And I believe there needs to be a greater level of cooperation and support between the public and the private sectors. One of my comments about the Solarium Commission, and frankly, this comes from my experiences early on with the creation of the Director of National Intelligence. Chairman Rogers, with all due respect to Congress, what really makes these kinds of things work is when you have champions. When we had champions inside the intelligence community who wanted to make a change, you're going to need champions in the private sector who want to create that environment where there can be more cooperation between the private sector and the government. And you're going to need champions on the government side as well who speak for this passionately. Because now having sat on both sides of the fence, I'm very well aware that there is information on either side that could be very, very helpful to the other. And we've got to first find a way, I think, to increase that sharing. We have to get, I think people might have looked at SolarWinds, or companies or what have you might have said, oh, good, we didn't use SolarWinds. It doesn't matter to us. Well, we always talk about cyber attacks. It's a matter of when, not if. I think that's already been said here. And we've really got to get people to think about that. If you look at the experience in the intelligence community, 9/11 is what brought greater cooperation between intel and law enforcement. We do not need a cyber 9/11 to bring us to that point of cooperation. And I think that I think some of it is just basic for companies, and big companies get it and do it well. In other words, you don't need a huge cyber budget. You need to identify what are your most critical elements for you to be operational, whether it's you or whether you have counterparties you have to worry about, and then how do you go about protecting them? But there are some companies that just don't have the budget. And to your point, are there ways that the government can help finance some of that? I think that's a definite possibility, because certainly, I mean, this is somewhat legendary maybe by now, but there was a casino in the United States that was penetrated through the Bluetooth of the thermometer in the aquarium in the front lobby. Who would have thought that company was a vector of attack for a cyber attack? But it is. So you've got to be thinking about it like an attacker, and you've got to be thinking about every endpoint, and you've got to be thinking how to protect that collectively. And I think part of that is government, private sector. Part of that is helping the private sector think about protecting itself.
Why don't we just stay on this for a moment? And I don't know if there are any other specific reactions people want to offer towards each other's suggestions. I mean, just a couple of things that strike me and come out of some of your comments would be, should we, for example, former Assistant Secretary of the Treasury Ireland, should we be equipping Treasury to have a lot more ability with its intelligence teams to detail what's happening to American private sector firms by way of cyber attack, so that the government's better equipped perhaps to use sanctions or other kinds of financial penalties against the perpetrators? I know in some cases we've had the ability. We figured out that North Korea attacked Sony. We figured out some of the other attacks that the chairman mentioned a few minutes ago, but maybe there's a need for more capacity right there. Fred, you talked about empowering some kind of a cyber czar to be able to essentially hold companies accountable to certain cyber standards. Maybe, don't hold them accountable to not being attacked. That's a little beyond their control, perhaps, but to at least being well enough prepared. And if they don't do that, then they, lose access to the financial system or whatever they need to do their business until they've taken amends. That's another possible solution. And then Chairman Rogers, you talked about how maybe the NSA wasn't seen as the right vehicle for trying to, protect more of the domestic infrastructure grid, for example, but maybe you've got other ideas that you've thought about and want to mention. So let me just, if I could, turn you all loose one more time, and maybe we'll go Fred and Chairman Rogers and Secretary Ireland again, just to see if there's anything more that you would want to add to take us to the next level of specificity or in reaction to each other's ideas. Fred, over to you. You're still muted.
One thing, talked about cyber deterrence. I mean, one thing that we've never really done is to define that term. I mean, within months after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there were civilians of a strategic mind who started thinking about this, the bomb. Is this a brand new weapon? Is it something like a weapon like we've always experienced, just bigger? What is it? And they, Bernard Brodie wrote a book at the end of 1945, The Absolute Weapon, saying, in the past, militaries have thought about winning a war. Now we have to start thinking about deterring one. The basic concept of deterrence is retaliate in kind, and to do that, you need a second strike force that's basically invulnerable. And much grew out of that. There hasn't been any such declaration like that with cyber. And you can't, one way that deterrence is held with nuclear is that there is a big, bold red line between the use and non-use of nuclear weapons. We haven't been spitting out 100-ton mini nukes over the years. It's just nuclear or non-nuclear. With cyber, you can't say we're going to deter all cyber attacks because there are thousands, or at least thousands of attempts an hour, a day. I don't know how many there are. But so one thing that really hasn't been declared yet is what kind of thing are we deterring? What do we want to deter? You talked about a bank. If one bank gets attacked, is that the federal government's responsibility to do something about it? What about a half dozen banks? I mean, I don't think the first time that a president of the United States went on TV and said, in response to an attack, we're going to retaliate to this in a manner and a time that I will specify later. It was when the North Koreans attacked Sony Pictures for making the movie, which made fun of Kim Jong-un. Now, I don't think anybody would have guessed that would be the event after thousands of attacks on defense corporations and government agencies, that would be the event that would set the president to declare publicly that we're not going to put up with this. So you have to kind of create expectations. I mean, that's what deterrence is part of about. That hasn't happened. Another possibility, there have been commissions, white papers. There have been dozens of these things over the last 15 years. A lot of them read with remarkable consistency. Here's a suggestion somebody could do right now. The commission should be set to go back and read all of these reports and to come up with the solutions or proposals in them for which there's a certain consensus and that make sense and that have pertinence to what's going on now. They're like Cyber Command, this amazingly competent organization, all these computer scientists that are well trained, they know the tactics, they know how to attach certain kinds of cyber attacks to certain targets, but they know nothing about strategy, they know nothing about history, because they haven't been given that as part of their tools. So at a very high level of government, some first principles have to be established. Before everything else is kind of secondary to this, to what is deter, what are we trying to deter, and what are we going to do about it if it happens? And you create, one reason why some country doesn't launch a nuke our way is that they know exactly what's going to happen if they do. Right now, nobody really has any idea what's going to happen to them. The weight of the evidence suggests that not much is going to happen to them. But first, we have to have a national policy and a strategy on what this whole thing is all about. And you know, quite aside from what the chairman and others have been saying about where we don't have the kind of resilience to survive this kind of attack and so forth, the first step is, you know, what resilience to do what, in the face of what, under what circumstances? And then let's not waste the decades of studies that have been carried out. Let's see if there were any good ideas buried in paragraph 135 of something that was written in 1994. There might be.
You the same question to push any of your ideas specifically a little further forward, or just to reiterate some of the key points as we start to think about wrapping up. But I would love to hear, you mentioned that you've been through a number of these possibilities. I wondered which ones at this point strike you as the most promising for reorganization or reallocation of responsibility.
Yeah, and thank you for that. I'm just going to just unpack a little bit of what Fred said, and I think you hit to the key point on why we're all so confused. Is it the responsibility of the federal government if a bank gets attacked, even if it's Russia or Iran or North Korea? My argument is, what's the difference if a sub comes out of the water and fires a pretty accurate missile and blows up the bank in New York? Yes, absolutely. That is absolutely the federal government. I don't think anyone would deny it. But if you're on the losing end of that and you've lost all your money and the federal government is trying to figure out how they use the FDIC to make up for that difference, I think we would have a very different conversation. So one-offs, in my mind, are no different than, you know, sabotage efforts or other things where we say, well, listen, we will raise the kinetic response if that's the case. So we've had all these discussions in the government about what that deterrence looks like, all the way up to a kinetic response. You turn out the lights in the eastern seaboard and people die, guess what? We got missiles. We're going to light them up and send them your way. We're not going to tolerate it. However, short of that, it gets really murky very quickly because we don't know really what options we have so that we can make sure that it doesn't escalate beyond our willingness to play in that game, if that makes sense. So deterrence is important. But my first point of that is, and it gets back to, I think, your question, Michael, is we have to decide, do we want certain agencies that we know have just phenomenal capability, best in the world, engaged in the protection of the private sector, of that bank, of the small little utility that's operating in rural America that we know for a fact has been at least prepped, the battlefield has been prepped by foreign adversaries getting in those networks and laying in wait, right? That tells me that they're willing to turn them off when they think they need to, right? My argument is we're already in this fight, but we're not in the fight. We're watching it happen to us. And so a level of deterrence in my mind is start to go down that list, but you can't get to real deterrence unless we fix this problem of the private sector trying to defend itself against nation state capabilities. And remember, just regulation won't do it. If that were the case, the government would be perfect, right? The government just got hacked in a massive way. They're not going to be, it's pretty hard for them to go out and lecture the private sector about how terrible their cyber is. I could tell you story after story about bringing there was one particular agency went up to brief a small group of business people, and they were briefing about an iOS system that the government had, and they were about 4 ahead of that particular briefing. It was almost embarrassing, right? And so the government has not caught up to capability to even get out and have these conversations in so many places. So my argument is, you want to fix this? Collective defense inside the government. And I think, I'm not sure, Leslie, if you and I disagree on this or not. I've come full circle on the cyber director. I opposed it in the Bush administration because they said we could handle it. I said okay to the Obama administration because they said, no, we can handle it. The Trump administration said, no, we got this, nobody do anything. And candidly, all three failed. All three of those administrations failed on cyber. And so I had flipped around on this and said, you know what, we need a forcing function to get the government to start playing well together and allocate its resources and its capability in a way that protects the U.S. government writ large. And to me, SolarWinds was the greatest example of that. That's why I talk about SolarWinds so much, because of the level of penetration and the effort that they put into it. So I think you have to have that. We do have it now in law. I think if that person doesn't have the ability to go in and knock some heads, it's not going to work. And that person directly needs to report to the President of the United States and walk in and say, guess what? Agency A is not playing nice in the toy box. Well, let's get that settled right away. That starts this collective defense, in my mind, where you're starting to share in real time amongst government players. And then this other piece, if you really want to get to a good deterrence, can we have machine-to-machine, real-time sharing with the private sector as far upstream as we can get to an ISP to start eliminating these attack vectors as much and as fast as we can. And these are steps you have to take to get to that process. And candidly, the DHS is not going to do it. We can say it does. This was a political solution to a very technical problem because they thought, well, if we put it in a civilian agency, people will feel better about it. Well, guess what? We are getting ravished. It's time to stop saying we're going to feel better about it and actually do something about it. And if you're going to put it in DHS, then have the NSA actually stand it up and then put the bodies in there to get it right under their authorities. I don't know any other way to do that. So to me, this is the different steps. Once you get that collective defense, sharing in real time, I think then you can go to a better deterrent. Because now, if I go out and flick you in the forehead for something bad that you did to us, and you decide you want to come back, we can help the private sector defend itself from what is nation-state activity. And remember, all the other examples you gave are all in the purview of the federal government, right? Nuclear deterrence, yes. Conventional deterrence, yes. That's why we own the air. That's why we're fighting in space now, right? Because that's the kind of things that we need to do to protect the country. But that one last domain that where everyone's afraid to talk about is absolutely the wild, wild west, and our adversaries know it. And so they're spending just enough money. They're doing just enough to get, to be successful, and they have not had any deterrence or any consequence or real consequence. We did the indictments along the few years, and by the way, the reason the president did Korea, to your point, Fred, is because what the easiest target to get out there publicly and say we're going to do something was North Korea. Because we knew they had limited capability to really come out and hurt. I mean, they still have it, but more limited capability. You try that with China or Russia, this thing slides out from under people who are trying to keep the lid on these things. So anyway, I think it's a step process where we can actually get to that big deterrence day, and I think deterrence is huge. But we need that collective defense. We need that cyber sharing in real time. And we can do this, by the way, for people who are saying, what about civil liberties and privacy protection? We can do it. We can protect, especially today. 10 years ago, we were okay. Today, we're really good at this, about anonymizing that information and still providing a really senior level of protection. Anyway, you can say you got me on my soapbox, Fred. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm loving it. Thank you both. And now Secretary Ireland will give you the last word. I would really want to just say how much of a privilege it's been to be part of just listening to such a fantastic conversation. So we'll give everybody one last quick wrap-up opportunity. But first, Leslie Ireland, the same question to you about what really needs to be done and any further detail you want to offer.
Sure. I tell you, Fred and Mike, you're a tough act to follow. Yeah. So let me start by saying, Mike, you wanted to know where I come down on having an overarching cyber czar, for the lack of a better term. I'm all for it. Oh, in the corporate world, we talk about cyber security as an enterprise-wide issue. It is not the purview of the CISO or the IT department. Every business line, you've got shareholder issues, you've got legal issues, you've got regulatory issues, you're going to have issues with the government. Everybody has to own it. And I think the same is true in the government. I'll tell you one of the questions that came to my mind when I heard about SolarWinds was, do we think about concentration risk? And by that I mean, as a government, do we think about how we are using technology on some of our critical systems, and are we bunched up in particular areas? And I'm thinking particularly migration to the cloud or something like SolarWinds. Did that make us more vulnerable because we didn't have somebody who was looking at how are we deploying those systems? And do we need to think first and foremost within ourselves as a government as to how we split some of that up? Fred, to your question about what if it's just one bank, you know, the banks were hit by DDoS attacks from the Iranians starting in December of 2011. And they kept going until I think following September or September of the year after, and cumulative total of 175 some odd days. And again, internet-facing websites, so they aren't getting into the payment, settlement, or any of those systems, but nevertheless still very problematic for banks because it impacts their relationship with customers. And you can lose customers if they lose that confidence. And the financial sector wanted the US government to take action against the actor. We can now say it was the Iranians. We knew that at the time. We couldn't say it, but we can say it now. And there was a real debate about whether or not to take any kind of an action. And I think it frankly came down in part to the Secretary of the Treasury, who was concerned that the financial sector might not be completely prepared if the U.S. did take an action and the Iranians decided to come back even harder. So to say, have the government take an action, it's not that simple. There is a lot of discussion that has to go on, and some of it may be situational. The final point that I'd make on, I think information sharing is an important part of this. And when the financial sector would come in and talk to us at Treasury, a lot of what we heard was, we've got the IP addresses, we get that. And that gets around in a number of different places. It may come in directly from law enforcement. There are information sharing and analysis centers as part of critical infrastructure called an ISAC. There's an FSISAC. They would share that kind of IP address information. What they really wanted was to understand capabilities and intent of the more sophisticated actors. On the flip side of that is, so we've established that NSA isn't going to be watching these networks that the U.S. companies are riding on, but they are going to be watching the foreign actors, the cyber criminals, the cyber actors, and understanding what they want to do. I think there needs to be greater cooperation between the public and private sectors and helping the public sector, helping collectors understand what are the most critical parts of infrastructure, that if they see an actor discussing it or preparing for action against it, they can alert that. Right now, I think we've got a lot of really, really smart people in the intelligence community who understand about cybersecurity, but I don't know that they understand the vulnerabilities within the sectors themselves. And I think there could be a way to promote either information sharing or developing working groups and bringing people in. You don't need a security clearance for this. Bringing people in from energy, natural gas, the financial sector, what have you, and have them sit down and talk with analysts about what are the most important areas that they need to protect, and then have that help inform the collection that's going to be vital to protecting the sector.
Well, let me just thank you all. It's been fantastic. Please get my attention if anybody has a final wrap-up comment. But otherwise, let me just take a minute to thank you all for what you've been doing to inform this debate and for the country throughout your careers on these and related questions. And I know we're all grateful to have been part of this forum here, taping in March for the ultimate broadcast in April. So I think without further ado, we will wish everyone well and happy spring. Stay safe. Keep your computers in good shape and improve your resilience on that front as well. And thank you for joining us today. Farewell.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you, Leslie. Fred.
Take care, both of you. Bye-bye.
Michael O'Hanlon, Fred Kaplan, Chairman Rogers, Leslie Ireland, let me just echo, thanks again for doing that. Thanks again for your service. And most importantly, because we're now live, thanks for zooming in for the live Q&A part of our session. I've warned our panelists in advance of the questions I'm going to pose to them. And I will note that Chairman Rogers has a hard stop at 1200 at noon. So if he has to leave us abruptly, apologies in advance. All of these folks have very, very busy schedules, and we're grateful that they've taken the time to zoom in for us. Michael O'Hanlon, I'm going to start with you because while you claim to not be an expert in cybersecurity, you are certainly one of the our nation's foremost experts in national security. So I'd like you to try to put this in the larger context. Russians on the border of Ukraine. We're about ready to withdraw from Afghanistan. We are in a cutthroat economic competition with China. Where does cybersecurity fit in the larger global context, if you would?
Well, thanks, Ron, and it's a privilege to be part of this amazing panel. So thank you for including me. Let me say that as I look at why wars happen through history, quite often, maybe most often, it's because someone develops a theory of the case for how they can achieve a quick win, a quick and decisive win. I'm working on a project now on the outbreak of World War I, and certainly the Germans with their Schlieffen Plan thought they had the silver bullet. And usually countries don't go to war when they expect the war to be long, protracted, difficult, bloody, and perhaps inconclusive or ending in defeat. People go to war when they think they can win and win fast, as a rule, through history. And better people than I, like Jeffrey Blaney and Stephen Van Evera, have made these arguments as historians or strategists. So bringing now the attention to the topic at hand, cyber presents a realm in which a country could develop a theory of the case for how they can defeat a peer rival quickly and decisively. Because if our command and control and communications and intelligence capacities are taken down and can't come back up, this disconnects our nervous system from all the wonderful and powerful weapons and other capabilities we have as a nation. Whether it is Russia or China thinking they could do this to us, or even just do it long enough that they could execute some aggression against a neighbor and get away with it, create a fait accompli. And then even if we rebuild our command and control over the next few months, maybe it's too late for our national will to be able to return and resolve the matter. As I think philosophically about how great power war could happen, cyber vulnerabilities are among my greatest concerns, because I just don't see somebody waking up one day and saying, you know, I'm pretty sure I can take out 80% of the American naval fleet in a war of attrition before they can take out 80% of my fleet. That's not the way countries usually make decisions on going to war. They usually think they have found a possible path to a quick, easy, decisive win, whether it's the Japanese in Pearl Harbor, whether it's Hitler in France, the Schlieffen Plan, et cetera. So history teaches me, and modern great power relations teach me, that we have to be most concerned at all, not about how fast we develop the next Army artillery tube or the next F-35 production lot, but how well we can ensure that our cyber systems will be resilient and that they will be seen as resilient by adversaries. That's just one slice at your question, Ron. I'm not going to try to cover it comprehensively, but I'd rather just be clear and emphatic on the fact that as we talk about the national defense strategy of Jim Mattis and Donald Trump, and we talk about the third offset that came before from the Obama-Biden administration, we await what President Biden now is going to do with his team at the Pentagon, led by Secretary Austin. I think we have to focus very heavily on this question of cyber vulnerability, making sure we do not have it. Obviously, we need offensive capabilities, we need espionage capabilities, et cetera, of our own. But my number one worry for making sure that great power war doesn't happen in technical terms is the cyber resilience of our military and of the broader national infrastructure that supports it. So I'll just begin with that answer to your question. Thank you, over and out.
Michael, thanks very much for that. I warned our audience about an hour and a half ago when we started the conference that we were going to take a Clausewitzian view of cybersecurity, and I think you've certainly put us in that mindset. We've got to change the calculus. Chairman Rogers, you know a lot about the law. A former FBI agent, lots of things in your former lives suggest that you've thought a lot about the law. So I'm going to be a bit provocative and ask you to think a little bit about the law of cybersecurity, the law of war, in Michael O'Hanlon's terms. Where's the line, fuzzy, sharp, where's the line between cyber espionage, cyber sabotage, prepping the battlefield, and an outright attack? And Dr. Kaplan, I'm going to put you up next after Chairman Rogers is done to talk about whether bombing a bank or taking out a bank with a cyber attack, is that the trigger? What's the cyber equivalent of mutually assured destruction? But Chairman Rogers, you get to go first.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Well, if you look back at the history of this, it's relatively recently that we saw a prepping of the battlefield event in cyberspace. So the reason we have a cyber command today is really to recognize that the cyber domain is a fighting war domain. Like land, air, sea, and space all have their own fighting domains, so does cyberspace. So it is recognized universally amongst national security folks that we are in a new era, and cyberspace is a part of that. We saw the Russians use prepping the battlefield in their invasion in Georgia. So they went in and turned off banks and government buildings and caused chaos before they sent in their troops and their heavy armor. And it was pretty effective. If you look at from a tactical perspective, very effective, really disorienting to the command, all the things that you want to have happen when you prep the battlefield before you move in with troops and equipment, it happened. And so from that day forward, everybody went, oops, okay, we got this. We are going to also have to have these capabilities and understandings. So if you look at espionage as an FBI agent, remember, espionage is a crime in the United States. So if you further espionage activities or you engage in them yourselves, that's a crime. And I argue you should be caught and you should be punished. Doesn't mean that other countries don't make attempts in espionage that don't always result in arrests, right? So that's that international diplomacy of the understanding of the great game, if you will, about making of espionage on all fronts for a whole host of purposes. And done correctly, by the way, espionage, spying, intelligence gathering, in my mind, helps prevent more conflicts than it has ever started. And my argument is that done right, it's a really important component of our international domestic relations, if you will. That being said, what we saw in SolarWinds, and again, we talked a little bit about this in the panel, many said, oh, that's an attack. It wasn't an attack, it was espionage. Still a crime, and we actually today, the White House came out with sanctions and expulsions related around the SolarWinds attack. That's certainly one way to do it. If there were a US component to it, the FBI certainly should pursue charges, meaning if there's an insider element, somebody helped the Russians do it inside of a network, all of that is fair game when it comes to the espionage statute. It's still not great. So in prepping the battlefield and execution means one thing, but getting ready to prep the battlefield, meaning why are the Russians and the Chinese and others trying to get into our electric grid in the United States? Do you think it's to turn off the lights today? I would argue probably not. But what it is to do is to prep the battlefield. They want to have the ability to turn things off if they need to turn them off. And so they want to get in and say, listen, if we want to shut the power off in this particular part of the country, cause chaos in America, why we're, I don't know, I'll throw it out there. Let's say the Chinese decide to invade Taiwan. I don't believe that's going to happen. But let's just say they make that calculation. They want the prepping of the battlefield to be chaos, disruption, can't get electricity, can't get cash, can't get gasoline. That to me is kind of this new space. The United States is probably not as well suited as we would all like to believe we are in that particular portion. We wrestle a lot with what the consequences, what the policies are of our ability to prep the battlefield. We have lots of capability, but do we deploy it in a way we're ready to go at a moment's notice, I think is a big question. And that's something policymakers are going to have to get through. That is in and of itself, it's not illegal. It would be illegal in countries if we go there and steal things. They're going to think it's espionage. They're going to think that's a crime, just as we would here in the United States. Doesn't mean that countries don't engage in it, and doesn't mean that they shouldn't engage in it from cyber perspective, if that makes sense. So I think we're on the spectrum. We don't have this quite figured out because we don't understand what other people's threshold, other countries' thresholds are for prepping the battlefield, acts of espionage, acts of sabotage. Now, clearly that crosses the line. That means that they're doing something to disrupt some activity. So if they ever did flick the switch and turn out the lights, that's a disruptive act. That's an act of the sabotage. We clearly understand that that takes us to a whole new level in this understanding about cyber conflict. But there's a whole bunch of areas that are pretty murky. And again, just to have senior policymakers come out and say that the Russians attacked us when they stole information worries me a little bit. It means that we haven't come to that place where we all understand the differences between what is their successful espionage operation. We don't want them to ever be successful at an espionage operation, and what is fair game in the great game of spying back and forth, if that makes any sense whatsoever, Dave.
No, it really does. And I think you've pointed out two things. Number one, words matter, and rhetoric can be dangerous, can be provocative. It may actually light a fuse that that you can't put out. And secondly, I'll have to agree with you as a former member of the intelligence community. I think intelligence collection, intelligence gathering to discern a nation's intent has stopped or mitigated more conflicts than it has started. But it seems to me that one of the things you've put on the table in trying to figure out where we sit on this fuzzy continuum, Fred, Dr. Kaplan, let me ask you, is cyber as an act of war a precursor to something more traditionally kinetic? We talked about bombing a bank, I know partly in cheek, but is it leading to something more traditionally kinetic, or can it be an act of war in and of itself? What's the cyber equivalent of mutually assured destruction?
Well, I think it goes back when Robert Gates was Secretary of Defense under the Bush administration, and he was getting these daily briefings about cyber attack here, a cyber attack there. He asked his legal staff, at what point do these incursions become an act of war as recognized under international law? And about a year later, he got a response, which was basically, yes, under some circumstances, a cyber attack could be an act of war. That was it. So, the chairman says that we haven't worked some of this out. I would say we haven't worked out even the most basic things. You asked about, is this comparable to mutual assured destruction? Well, again, first you have to define what is destruction. Second, mutual assured destruction involved retaliation in kind. Well, let's say that the attacker isn't wired up to the internet as much as we are. All of his bank records aren't online. What do we do then? Now, President Obama, when he was laying out a cyber policy, said explicitly that we reserve the right to respond to a cyber attack with non-cyber means. In other words, you could do a kinetic attack in response to a cyber attack. But that still leaves open the question, what was this initial attack? What was the intent of that? What was the consequence of that? And what effects and consequences do you want to lay on the other side? You raised the question of, if a bank is attacked, what should we do? Banks are attacked about 100 times a day. That's one reason why they spend a lot of money to hire experts who might otherwise be working for the government to protect them from attacks or to be resilient in the face of an attack. One possibility of the government says, nope, don't worry about it, we're going to take over all of this stuff, is that maybe the banks will stop doing it themselves, and they're the ones who are really quite competent. Because we're in a strange situation, even compared with other countries, because about 90% of what's online is owned by private companies, not by the government. And it's private companies that have resisted any kind of government regulation or mandatory security standards. So what does the government do? What are the government's obligations in this kind of context? It's just not clear. And so I think, and I said this earlier, but before we get into these fine-tuned questions about how many banks have to be attacked before the government takes action. We have to define much more clearly what this is all about. And also, as I think, as Michael pointed out, it's extremely unlikely that, except for one-off things like, attacking Aramco's hard drives in retaliation for Stuxnet, it's very unlikely that there's going to be a major cyber attack isolated from anything else. It's probably going to be the first step or some kind of step of a broader war, or at least of a broaching of a broader conflict. And so it's a mistake to look at cyber as something distinct. You can do that with nuclear war because, I mean, as Bernard Brodie called it in his 1946 book, it is kind of the absolute weapon. It's something that even goes beyond in destructiveness what might be considered a rational war aim. And so you have nuclear weapons to retaliate against that. Cyber is almost the exact opposite of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons haven't been used since the first two that were dropped in 1945. Cyber attacks, however defined, go on every minute of the day. They are of widely varying degrees of consequences and damage. It is, as the chairman was saying, it's a very ambiguous matter whether something is an attack or whether it's just an intelligence operation, whether it's prepping for the battlefield, which itself is nothing to consider an attack to be retaliated against. So as I say, we've gone a long ways down the technology and the tactics of cyber attacks and cybersecurity without first articulating first principles. And I think before we get any deeper or more detailed into what do we do under the following circumstances, we have to figure out what our policy is.
So think before we act. And not an easy thing to do, but it all comes back to this calculus of war that Michael O'Hanlon talked about, and the extension of that, the miscalculation of a country and or its response to a cyber attack, whether it's separate or a precursor to something more dramatic. Last but not least, in that regard, Secretary Ireland, Leslie. I'm going to tell a little bit of a secret about you, because when I first met Leslie, she was one of our nation's most established experts on Iran. And our conference is co-sponsored by U.S. Central Command. They worry about that region. So I'm wondering, Leslie, if you could give us a bit of a regional take, particularly in this context of calculus and miscalculation. Where do proxies like Iran or the Syrian cyber army or whatever it's called, where do they fit in this calculus?
Sure, thanks, Ron. And as I thought about your question, I wanted to take a look at it from the perspective of how it demonstrates the different implications or approaches that these countries are taking. And so, for example, let's start with Iran. And thinking about what Iran probably is more well known for was the DDoS attacks against the US, UK, and Israeli financial sector back between 2011 and 2013. Now, admittedly, they did not get into the networks. It was public-facing websites, but it still caused a great deal of difficulty for the banks themselves. It was millions of dollars in remediation costs, not to mention the damage to customer relations. And I appreciated Fred's comments about how do you think about the US government or any government getting involved in some kind of a response, because certainly at that time, the financial sector in the United States was eager for government help in countering this attack. And I think that gets down into a very slippery slope. And I agree with him profoundly that it's something that needs to be discussed and debated as we go forward. But I would point out that these DDoS attacks were, I believe, in direct response to US sanctions and international sanctions that were being levied at that time in an effort to pressure Iran on its nuclear weapons program. And in the Iranian mindset, I think that was a bit of a tit for tat. They saw it as a way of coming after an international financial sector. And so in terms of a tool of foreign policy, it was a way for the Iranians to respond, but not to respond in a way that really was that provocative or certainly threatened to get too far out of control. Now, you take another example, and I think this has already been mentioned about the Iranian attack on Saudi Aramco, where they bricked some 30,000 computers and really interfered with the operations of the company. It's indicated that they are both capable and willing to undertake a destructive attack. And I think a number of years have passed since that time, and certainly Iran's capabilities have only improved in that time. Ron, you also mentioned the Syrian Electronic Army, and I think there's another example of what I would call unintended consequences. So Syrian Electronic Army probably became better known to audiences here in the West back in April of 2013 when they hacked into, I think it was the Associated Press's Twitter account, and announced that the White House had been bombed and that President Obama had been injured. Well, what happened was a reaction of the US stock market dropping 1,000 points very rapidly. And I don't think that was the intention of the Syrian Electronic Army, but I think it goes to show that even a small actor taking what may be seemingly a small action can have a very significant impact, and we have to be wary of that. And finally, I think this conversation needs to include North Korea. And much like Iran, I think North Korea's cyber capabilities have only been improving over time. And the two that I would highlight, I think we've mentioned these before: willingness for destruction, the Sony hack back in November of 2014. And the thing that has stood out for me on that attack was not just that they wanted to be a destructive attack, but they were releasing emails that were potentially embarrassing. And a trend that we see now in ransomware is not only threatening a company with not letting them have access to their information, but threatening to release embarrassing or compromising or sensitive information about the perhaps clients in that company. And I don't know if North Korea was the first to do that, but I certainly think they gave an example. And finally, another way to get around perhaps US policy, international sanctions, North Korea demonstrated in their attack on the Central Bank of Bangladesh in 2016 that they are willing to rob banks. They went and tried to get $1 billion. They made off with about 80 million, and a second transaction for the balance of the 920 million, thankfully, was stopped. But it revealed to me a degree of thoughtfulness and about timing, taking advantage of different weekend structures in countries. So a Thursday, Friday weekend, or a Friday, Saturday weekend versus a Saturday, Sunday weekend, having contacts throughout Asia that could help them with this, and showed an intent that I think we need to be mindful of. That's an attack on a bank that I think if that happened in the United States, if thefts of that order were stolen, I think you would be hearing some conversation about what does the US government do to respond.
Leslie, thanks very much. And thanks to all of our panelists. I will tell you, it's pretty clear to me that those of us in the cybersecurity business have a lot to do, a lot to think about, but it's also full employment. So I think we're in pretty good shape. Michael O'Hanlon, thank you for moderating this panel. Buy his book, his next Brookings book. Chairman Rogers, you may have left us, but thank you for taking the time to be with us and listen to Mike's radio show. Fred Kaplan, thank you. Buy Fred's book, read it. We all have it. It's sort of standard reading for those of us in the Florida Center for Cybersecurity. And Leslie, thank you so very much. I will note that Secretary Ireland is on the Florida Center for Cybersecurity Board of Advisors. So she's part of our, at least my, adult supervision. And we look forward to hearing about your next chapter. So with that, we're going to take 30 minutes for lunch. Again, it's been a great, really thought-provoking morning. So take a deep breath, get some lunch, take a break, and we'll see you back here at exactly 12:35. We'll reconvene with this afternoon and tomorrow, focusing on what sort of things can we do to respond to the threats that we covered this morning. With that, thank you very much. We'll see you in a bit.